Hi guys, Totallydubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the AOC C24G2U. This is a Full HD 165Hz curved VA panel that's not to be confused with its sibling, which is the AOC 24G2U, because that has a 144Hz IPS panel and also it's a Full HD. Now this monitor can be found for around £190, so it's a budget gaming monitor. And if you're interested in purchasing it, the locally link in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store. Also down below, you'll see a link to my Instagram. It's at TotallyDubbed, and also a link to my car-centric website, TotallyEV. If you're interested in electric or hybrid cars, do give it a follow and do check in for the latest news and reviews. So without further ado, let's see how this monitor compares to its IPS sibling and to see if it's actually worth £190. So first off, in terms of raw specs, this is a 24 or 23.6 inch monitor. It's a Full HD 165Hz monitor that claims to have a 1 millisecond response time, that's MPRT. And it's a VA panel, and it's also got AMD FreeSync built in, and the FreeSync range is 48 Hz to 165 Hz. Elsewhere, this is a 16:9 monitor, it's curved, and it also has speakers built in. The 2-watt speakers are not exactly all that great, but it's just worth bearing in mind that it does have that included. In terms of inputs, it's got 2 HDMI 1.4 ports and 1 DisplayPort 1.2, and weirdly there's also a VGA port for those people who will still be using it, never use VGA. There's also 4 USB 3.2 ports, that's a USB hub. You'll have to connect it up via USB Type-B to Type-A cable, and there's also a headphone output as well as a 3.5mm jack output for you to connect up your headphones directly to the monitor if, for example, you don't have a DAC or some bookshelf speakers or something. And just before concluding the specs, it's also good to know that there are a few different iterations of this monitor. There's a 27-inch monitor, which is around £250 in the UK. There's also the AE model, so it's terminated by AE at the end, so C24G2AE, and that's essentially a more simplified version with a more limited stand, and it doesn't have some of the bells and whistles that this monitor does, and that is just slightly cheaper, so it's £169 in comparison to £189 that you find over here. So with the specs aside, let's talk about the build quality. Now the first thing that's pretty obvious is this is a curved monitor. It's 1500R curvature, adds a little bit of dimension to your gaming. Some people like it, some people hate it. I've got no sort of preference around it. It's just something that you should be mindful of. Now in terms of the stand, it does provide a good level of adjustment. You've got pivot, height and tilt adjustment. You can't rotate it, but frankly, why would you bother with a curved monitor? And here the stand is actually pretty solid, and even though it's made out of plastic, it doesn't wobble at all. Now in terms of styling, I know some people have commented this in the past, but this has got a black and red styling, and yes, the red parts can't be removed, and if you're really adventurous you could always paint it if you so wish. I've heard that so many times on YouTube comments, but it is what AOC have decided to do. Subjectively, I think it looks good. It gives it kind of like a gaming type of look, and even from the back with its kind of red stylings. And no, it doesn't have any RGB lights before you ask. And now onto the OSD, which can be accessed through a set of physical buttons which are found underneath the right hand side on the monitor. Now the buttons are actually quite hard to press, and something of a complaint that I have of the monitor's design for the OSD. But I can't see most people accessing the OSD that often, so the OSD itself is actually very comprehensive. You've got brightness and contrast ratio settings over here, and eco mode if you so wish. There's a color setup mode, so you can tailor this in terms of the RGB values. There's also an sRGB mode that you can enable through the color temperature. Picture boost if you so want it in a certain part of the monitor, OSD setup, which is pretty self-explanatory, and in terms of game settings, there are different things that you can enable or disable. The only thing worth bearing in mind is that if you do enable adaptive sync, which is enabled right now, it will disable MBR mode, and it also means that overdrive can't go in its boost setting, which reduces the brightness, and I'll get into that in just a bit, just so something that you should be mindful about. And in terms of extra settings, not really all that important other than the fact of knowing that it's running at the right resolution and the maximum refresh rate, which is 165 Hz. And now we get on to performance, and let's start off with image quality. Now first off, in terms of its sRGB range, in terms of gamut coverage, it covers a pretty perfect level. However, the gamut volume is a little bit overzealous and therefore is a little bit outside of the sRGB range. Now, when it comes to color accuracy in sRGB, and so that's for putting the monitor in sRGB mode through the OSD, what you'll find is the average delta is around 2.2 with a maximum of 4.4. Now those figures are not so great in comparison to its IPS sibling, but in the grand scheme of things, given this is a budget panel, then it's perfectly fine. It's just, you should be mindful of the fact its IPS sibling is just far better in terms of color accuracy. Now in terms of contrast ratio, this is one of its biggest selling points because VA panels have naturally larger contrast ratios over TN and IPS panels, and 2,700 to 1 in my test kind of proves that its contrast ratio is very impressive. Now, what does this all mean and how does it actually look like in person? Well, quite frankly, the VA panel looks great. It doesn't look as punchy as the IPS panel, but on the whole, the VA panel does portray a really good overall tonality in terms of the image. Now, the only downside of using it in sRGB mode is that it limits its overall brightness to around 180 nits. Now, that is pretty dim in most scenarios, and let alone the fact that if you were to take it off sRGB mode and put it, let's say, on user mode, then it goes up to around 260 nits, which is also not that impressive. Similarly, if you are going to be gaming in a complete pitch black room, I do find it quite interesting that its minimum brightness is only 110 odd nits. Now, I was expecting it to drop to around 50 or 40 nits or something like that, specifically because it's a VA panel, but unfortunately it doesn't get that dim. So for those people who might be quite sensitive to a bright screen, so this might be seemingly quite good, if you take it in a complete pitch black room, then I think you'll find yourself finding the monitors a bit too bright, which seems ironic given the fact of what I've just said, that the monitor is not bright enough in a bright sunlit room. Now, there is a way to bring it even lower in terms of brightness, but that is only if you enable MBR mode, and that will bring it down to around 77 nits, and that's at MBR scale to the maximum. No matter what setting you use in terms of colors, as long as you don't have it in, let's say, sRGB mode and you have it in user or normal mode, then you can have it, you can enable MBR and adjust that scale. As for brightness uniformity, my panel does a decent job. Of course, it's all pretty much panel lottery. In the top left-hand corner, it did seem to be leaking a little bit of light. And in terms of my backlight bleed tests, I was actually pleasantly surprised to see how well this monitor was able to deal with, well, backlight bleed. In comparison to IPS panels, yet again, VA and TN panels would be seemingly a better choice for those people who either play in a completely dark scenario or playing games or watch a lot of movies with very dark scenes. These panels will be a little bit better suited for you guys in comparison to an IPS panel that will suffer from that backlight bleed. And now we move on to the most important part, the gaming performance. Now, first off, let's talk about AMD FreeSync and G-Sync. I can't test AMD FreeSync because I don't have an AMD graphics card, but with my RTX 2080 Super connected over DisplayPort, I had no issues running G-Sync. Now, its FreeSync or /G-Sync range is around 48 Hz to 165 Hz, so it's worth bearing that in mind. So if you were to drop under that region, you might experience some stuttering. So just something to be kind of mindful about. Now, as for its refresh rate, it does go up to 165 Hz. You can customize this if you so wish, and I can confirm it was running at 165 Hz via various tests that I did. Now, the thing is with 165 Hz is that it's supposedly aimed for more competitive players or more hardcore FPS gamers, because if anything above 144 Hz is really aimed at these competitive players. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't really translate to its response time and input lag. So again, people look at specs and they think this is going to be the perfect monitor for them, and then when you come to using it in person, it's actually not that great. So breaking it down in terms of its input lag, I did find it to be a little bit sluggish, specifically in comparison to its IPS C24G2U sibling. It just wasn't as responsive in terms of me clicking a button and it appearing on the screen and on the monitor. As for the response time of the monitor, there's a variety of different overdrive settings you can use. I used it on extreme mode. There is another mode called boost mode, but then that limits the brightness again. And if you're going to be using that, or let's say MBR mode, then it's going to be quite hard to see the monitor. So for me, even at 100% brightness, using it on extreme mode, I was struggling to see enemies in my bright sunlit room just because it just wasn't as bright as I had expected this monitor to kind of perform. Now, as a result, that means that my performance wasn't good in deathmatch, and I know I didn't take it to a competitive game, but truthfully, I died so many times in deathmatch, and I can't just blame the monitor, but it just wasn't responding to my inputs, and the monitor's response time just felt a little bit sluggish, even in its highest kind of overdrive mode. Now, furthermore, on top of that, there is a little bit of inverse ghosting that occurs. It is minimal in a game like Counter-Strike, but taking on a game like Destiny 2, or let's say a little bit more intensive like Valorant or Battlefield, then you will notice a little more trailing, specifically when you look at, like, let's say trees and foliage and things like that. As such, you might want to even dial down the response time setting to normal or switch it off altogether. But again, here you'll be incurring even slower response time rates of this VA panel. So what I'm trying to say over here is that despite it having 165 Hz and a claimed 1 milliseconds MPRT response time, the monitor just doesn't perform as a competitive gamer would expect. Now, if you're a casual gamer, you will be pleased to know that yes, this monitor's perfectly fine. You've got that high refresh rate to have it there. You've got an input lag which isn't that great, but it's not going to be overly important to you as a casual gamer. And also on top of that, its response time setting can be dialed down to a kind of medium setting, and therefore you don't incur that much inverse ghosting. Now, the issue is that this monitor is competing with its IPS sibling, which its IPS sibling was truly fantastic throughout everything, from image quality to response time, input lag, and even its refresh rate at 144 Hz. Yes, you don't get those extra several hertz that you might want, but truthfully, as a competitive gamer myself, I don't really care about that. I care about input lag and response time, and these are things that this monitor can't offer. So where is this monitor even meant for? Who is it meant for? Well, all I can say is potentially casual gamers who want a good contrast ratio and a curved experience and want potentially higher refresh rate for some odd reason, and you're not competitive, then this monitor might be for you. Truthfully, my suggestion would be to go for the IPS panel. No matter if you're a casual or a hardcore gamer, I think that IPS panel, while it might not offer the same contrast ratios as this monitor, it is otherwise a lot better monitor to pick. That is my honest, unbiased, independent opinion. If you do appreciate this, make sure you give it a like, subscribe to see more from my channel, and of course favorite and share if you feel that this video will be helpful to your family and friends. Alright guys, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care, and bye bye.